Hi, friends. This week I'm so pleased to bring you another interview with Dr. Simon Cox, whom we last heard from on December 23rd when he gave us a deep dive on Buddhist descriptions of the subtle body. This time he's sharing his life journey with us, from his time watching cartoons in Houston, Texas, including a Batman cartoon that started him on his lifelong quest to understand the subtle body, to his time training in Kung Fu and Taoist contemplative practices at Wudong Mountain in China, back to Houston and Rice University's Department of Religion, where he recently defended his dissertation on the subtle body. So get ready for an epic journey across continents, and be sure to tune in again on February 3rd when Simon will tell us about the Taoist subtle body. Welcome to Letting Grow, the podcast about one of the spiritual journey's most difficult and courageous moments, letting go of who we think we should be so we can grow into who we most deeply are. I'm your host, Claire Villarreal, and I appreciate your joining me today. So in your dissertation, you have these really interesting little autobiographical sections that give a little sketch of how you became interested in the subtle body in the first place, and then, explored that interest and followed it across a couple of different continents and whatnot. I'm wondering if maybe Batman is a good place to start.
Yeah, that's where I start in the dissertation.
Yeah.
Because, I have I'm very kind of historically minded person. So anything I do, I try to look into the historical context. Even watching a movie, I'll be looking up the actors and their histories and their personal interests and stuff like that. It kind of annoys my wife, actually, how I do it with absolutely everything. Any food we eat, the history of almonds, whatever, So when I was writing my dissertation, I was kind of encouraged by both of my advisors, Jeff Kripal and Anne Klein, to include a kind of a more personal dimension, because the whole thing was extremely intellectual, heady, kind of detached, which I like. I really don't like talking about myself, actually. So it was only with great resistance that I actually started writing these things. And I wrote them with this kind of abandon. I was like, well, whatever, this is an obscure dissertation on an obscure topic, and only 4 people are ever going to read this, so it's fine. But now it's been picked up by Oxford, and so evidently people will read this book, so I'm still trying to cope with that. But when I looked back into my history of where this whole interest began, where did I first hear about a subtle body, it was really a Batman, the animated series episode that aired in 1993, that has a kind of, where Batman gets a map of an occult anatomy that has the touch of death on it. So he can defeat this evil ninja, and there's a great fight scene on a volcano and all this stuff. And I realized I was wow, so I was 6 years old when I saw that, because I watched that show religiously. Actually, my whole family, we'd sit and watch it together. It was every Tuesday or something like that. So I definitely saw that episode the first day it came out, which was in February of 93. So that's where this whole kind of thing began. Batman finds this scroll that was written by this ancient master who had kind of created a martial art so powerful that he couldn't teach it to anyone because it was just too deadly. So he wrote the scroll and stuck it in a cave. The story doesn't actually make a whole lot of sense when you think about it. Why did he write the scroll? What was... So he kind of didn't want the secret to be lost, but he didn't want anyone to know it. So anyway, hundreds of years later, Batman's opponent finds this scroll, and he knows the touch of death, and Batman's got to take him out. So it basically, 1993, I'm a white kid from an upper middle class family in Houston, Texas. There's, everybody's doing martial arts. And so that's when I kind of started doing this kind of generic karate taekwondo mashup at the local community center. And our teacher was this guy who wore an American flag onesie. Stars and stripes, head to toe. It was. Wow. I have the pictures to prove it.
That's like Napoleon Dynamite, but for real.
Yeah, but for real. It's totally real. Yeah, totally unironic, I think. He's a very earnest guy. So anyway, that's where it all started. Yeah.
Wow. Do you remember what it was about seeing this Batman episode as a relatively small kid that like sparked with you?
I mean, it's just so cool. Like, what's cooler than ninjas?
That's a valid point.
Yeah, so it's this whole thing where Batman, he's in Gotham City, but he gets a call from kind of his old sensei, basically, who's like, hey man, we got to get you back here in Japan. And then there's these really cool flashback scenes to before he was Batman, when he was studying karate in Japan. It was just, I mean, it's the whole like super romantic Orientalist fantasy kind of all just captured in this one little kind of 23-minute episode. And so it was really, I mean, this sort of thing has been intriguing Europeans for centuries. This kind of projected or mystic East that has these kind of secrets. So that was really the first sip of that I got, I think, as a little kid, and it just totally blew my mind.
That's amazing. It's kind of amazing to get that first sip at the age of 6 too, because then like your whole childhood basically is colored by that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that was something that was kind of unique about maybe the 80s and 90s, was this was really the golden age of the kind of Saturday morning cartoon culture. And so this was stuff that was definitely in comic books in like the 1970s and 60s and stuff like that. But 6-year-olds, you're a little too young to read a comic book, but you're not too young to watch a cartoon. So this was the first time this stuff was being, this kind of like countercultural Orientalism, kind of alternate ways, body, things like yoga and martial arts. It was kind of the first time it was really packaged in a cartoon for consumption by, young minds like my own.
And boom, and it took off.
Yeah.
Wow. So you're inspired, you start taking this sort of like mashup martial arts system. At what point did you realize that you were like looking for the subtle body?
Well, yeah, it was really, so I kind of, generic white kid upbringing, jumped around to a bunch of different martial arts schools. As I kind of got into middle school, I did Taekwondo. Our school, strangely enough, had like a really robust after-school program. So we had after-school yoga, after-school Tai Chi. This wasn't a private school. This was a public school, like Houston
Wow.
Independent School District.
Wow.
But yeah, so really inexpensive after-school programs. Yeah, so I just kind of got to like sample like all these different practices before I was even like 10 years old. And like that's the kind of amazing thing about this is how unamazing it all actually is. This was totally normal for like a kid in the 90s in a big city. I wasn't raised on an ashram. My parents weren't into this stuff. My dad, I say in my dissertation, he's like an atheist, mathematical neuroscientist. My mom was kind of spiritual but not religious, Catholic-ish. So yeah, it was just kind of in the air,
Yeah.
But yeah, so eventually I made my way to a ninjutsu school, Bujinkan Ninjutsu, and there they had the maps, just like the one in the Batman episode. So I think I was 14 before I started that. But that I was like, these are the maps. These are the real things. I'm onto something here. And so I traveled to Japan in 2004, first at the age of 16, and then again in 2006, I was 19 then, to practice this stuff and kind of investigate the origins and where these maps actually came from and stuff like that. And I started studying Japanese. And so that's when this whole thing goes from being a kind of little childish kind of fantasy into something a bit more serious, more nerdy, slightly more grown up. Not too grown up though, of course.
I mean, 16, you don't want to get like, that's too early to write a dissertation about it, but the perfect age for martial arts.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I don't know if this is at all relevant, but I'm kind of struck by the fact that for you, like the entry point into the subtle body was martial arts, and that, it's been such an enduring sort of thread in your connection with this subtle body stuff. And I don't know if there's anything there, but I just want to give you an opportunity if you think there is a connection between, martial arts as your way in, and now the way that you understand or the way that you practice around the subtle body.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I traced this genealogy very in a very perfunctory manner in my dissertation, but the martial arts that I was into, really, this was kind of stuff that was popularized in the American counterculture, Bruce Lee. So, I mean, there are lots of dimensions to it. One of it is like martial arts in America. There's a lot of great recent scholarship on kind of martial arts and masculinity and how it's a kind of like alternate mode of masculine expression. And I wasn't like a super effeminate kid, but I certainly wasn't like macho. And so, like, if I was going to be like a cisgendered, heterosexual male, the models you see on like syndicated television weren't terribly appealing to me. And martial arts was like another way of like expressing masculinity, but without the kind of brutishness, maybe with a little aesthetic sophistication or something like that. So I think that's why it kind of innately appealed to me, like as a little kid, becoming going from boy to man sort of thing, this very nebulous rite of passage in our culture. But this stuff really, it came from the counterculture, but it wasn't just like Orientalist projection. That stuff, the countercultural things, were from Hong Kong and Taiwan cinema, which were themselves kind of cinematic transformations of Chinese novels, where this kind of culture of like the martial heroes that goes back into the novels of the Ming Dynasty. You're talking, the 1400s, which were themselves actually just like novelistic formalizations of the kind of Chinese theatrical tradition, extending all the way back into the Song Dynasty. So, we're in the kind of 11th century. So there's a really long history to this thing, these kind of stories of martial heroes forming brotherhoods and having like alternate codes of honor that are kind of countercultural. And so I viewed myself as very much just kind of a continuation of this kind of literary lineage, I guess you could say.
That sounds just like a really fascinating way to approach the whole topic of the subtle body. But I mean, there's just so much in the New Age, literature on it that you could have stumbled into, but instead it's the martial aspect and, like going right to Asia. Like, I think a lot of people end up heading for the Asian version of the subtle body, having gone through, stuff that really comes from theosophy or these like very translated versions of, Buddhist or Hindu texts. So it's just really interesting that it was Japan, it was martial arts for you that like cemented your connection with this stuff.
Yeah, I guess so. Like, to me, that seems like the most natural thing in the world. But I guess when you're thinking in broader cultural terms, it's not the normative path by which Westerners kind of get into this stuff, right? Yeah. So I think it also kind of goes to how my parents raised me. So I was raised non-religious. We do kind of like Easter or Christmas church sort of stuff when family was in town. But my parents just sort of tried to, they didn't raise me like to be anti-religious. They just kind of didn't really bring it up. And so, I think I had kind of those natural religious urges, longings that people have. Like Mircea Eliade has this term homo religiosus. And I think certain of us have a more religious sense than others, just kind of inborn. Some people are just more into it. And I think I was someone who kind of had that sense, that inspiration. But I wasn't really raised in a household where like the kind of religious forms were handed to me by my parents. So I started a real kind of like searching thing, even when I was like a little kid. And it was just a cool time because we had these cool cartoons with these transformations of countercultural Orientalism. But we also had the internet, and there were like websites like for like how to become a Jedi that I took super seriously. In like 4th grade, I would like print out like 50 pages of like Jedi sermons, and it was all in this like quasi-Protestant stuff that I can see now in hindsight. But at the time, I was like, "This is awesome, Jedi meditation." So the first meditations I ever did were Jedi meditations from this like JediAcademy.net. And there's this kind of like generic New Age meditations, visualizing glowing orbs, shooting energy into your body and stuff. But yeah, it was pretty, like, I don't think we've really come to terms with how weird a lot of this stuff was for 90s kids. But now that people like me, we're growing up, we're writing books that are getting published, I'm sure more and more of this stuff will start like having a conversation about it,
Yeah. there's so much there, and it's just such a different way of coming at these like fundamentally religious topics. You know, in the past it would have been through a religious tradition, and now it's, you know, it's pop culture.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's simultaneously totally decentralized because of the internet. You know, this stuff is just, it's all just out. Like, we have all the secret texts. It's all just on the internet, and it's translated into English, and there's no one telling you what to do with any of this stuff. Like, it's, yeah. I mean, you can view the New Age stuff through like a very negative lens, which a lot of scholars tend to do, is this sort of like fuzzy-headed syncretism. But at the same time, I think there's a really and like incredibly creative dimension to all of this stuff. That we're just in like the baby steps right now. We're just starting on this joy, or the kind of voyage, you know?
Yeah. To me, sometimes I see in this like New Age syncretism, like a real longing to reclaim something that the Western tradition has lost. So hopefully at some point we'll be, I don't know, more able to have this just be something people grow up with, and there are instructions, or there's like a context that goes with it. Yeah. Okay, well, I just wanted to like explore that a little bit because it's so interesting to me. So to rejoin you at the age of approximately 16, you're heading off to Japan for the first time to study martial arts. Like, what was that like to actually go to Japan and continue your quest there?
Yeah, that was, I think, kind of seminal for me. It was the first really kind of eccentric thing I probably ever did in my life, you know? Like, you know, you're 16 at that point, you mostly just kind of follow your parents around. And my parents are pretty cool, so we did some really cool stuff. You know, I lived in Spain for a year as a little kid, and then we lived in Germany for another year. So I'd kind of like been around, seen some things, you know? But Japan, I went kind of without my parents. So my teacher, Brian Tridico, and his wife at the time, and my classmate, Chris Nance, who was, I think he was like 15. He was a year younger than me. It was just the four of us went together. And Brian was like a total saint. He just like took us to all the teachers, introduced us to all these people. It was really just an absolutely incredible trip. And it was quite magical as well, because the Grandmaster, he lives outside of Tokyo. And so one day we're kind of going on a walk, and we just walked by his house. But he's a very kind of high-profile figure, and so I never expected to ever like talk with him. And we were just walking by his house, and he was standing right there at the front door. And he was like, "Oh, come in." And so like we got to go into the Grand Master's house, and he gave us tea and kind of like showed us around. And he had he's an extremely eccentric figure. He had actually like autographed pictures of like topless women on his wall, and who were like, "I miss you, Hatsumi Sensei," you know, XOXO. And he had an owl in his house. He had like 20 cats and like 20 dogs. And his house, yeah, it was real clutter. But I mean, yeah, it was amazing for me as I was like, wow, this is the Grand Master. And I was like, maybe he'll make me the next Grand Master or something, you know? Once he sees what an awesome ninja I am. So yeah, I think that it really changed me though. It made me realize that this stuff was like, oh, like the Orient isn't just like some imaginary thing. Like you can actually go to Japan and learn this stuff directly from these people, which totally alters your vision of the Orient, right? I mean, there's once the kind of, it's not just the death of romanticism. It's kind of breathing a new life into your kind of romantic vision, I think, and it kind of intermixing it with reality, which is a really interesting kind of alchemical process.
It is. Alchemical process. I feel like that's a great way to describe it. So coming back from that trip, like how did that impact the way you engage with martial arts, or like the quest for the subtle body going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I took my martial arts practice a lot more seriously after that, and throughout kind of high school, it was really the thing that kind of kept me sane in high school, throwing ninja stars at things. And you know, but also that was when I really began the intellectual journey. So there are these kind of all these scrolls that are all written in Japanese that have these very kind of esoteric teachings in them and stuff like that. And a lot of them have been published in books. So I started studying Japanese, and I started kind of college soon thereafter. And in college, I took 2 years of Japanese. I became proficient enough to translate all of the kind of technical texts from the martial arts stuff. And that's when I realized that translations, I started becoming very suspicious of translations in any language,
Yeah.
So I also studied classical Greek in college. I did 3 years of that. And so I was reading kind of Homer and, the Bible and stuff in Greek. And that's when I started getting really obsessed with languages. And that's when that kind of my subtle body interest really started to blossom, because I looked at other Japanese texts then, and I looked around, and I realized that most Japanese things, at least they almost like self kind of advertise as kind of just like knockoffs of more authoritative Chinese versions of things. So like the Japanese medical tradition is really kind of like a hodgepodge of different kind of Chinese medical stuff mixed a little bit with some kind of native Japanese things. So anyway, like I got the impression very quickly that if I really wanted to search for the subtle body, that it was really in the Chinese traditions, and specifically Taoism actually, that had the most like sophisticated and kind of rigorous engagements with this stuff.
So you've identified where you think the subtle body is. You've been to Japan. You found the breadcrumbs, but the breadcrumbs lead you to China.
Yeah.
So what happened next? Hi friends, want to join the Letting Grow tribe? I'll be starting a bi-weekly newsletter in early 2021 with links to articles, YouTube videos, other podcasts, and basically the best of the rebirth content I've come across lately. Some examples of the kinds of things I want to share with you include a snap judgment story about a bull who seemed to be the reincarnation of another bull, a viral article about the creepy things kids say, but some of them 100% seem to refer to previous lives, and some excerpts from the book I'm writing now about the lessons Tibetan Buddhist teachings on life and death offer to those of us going through transitions. Spoiler alert, that's all of us. Best of all, if you're subscribed, you'll get links to join free, live video calls with me and other subscribers every couple of months. So pause this episode now, find the newsletter sign-up link in the show notes, and join your tribe. You've been to Japan. You found the breadcrumbs, but the breadcrumbs lead you to China.
Yeah.
So what happened next?
So I was really in a hurry in undergrad. I really wanted to like get to the Orient, so I'm being a little hard on myself, I think, here. But I wanted to move to Japan to study full-time with this teacher that I had gotten to know, Somaya Sensei. So I kind of zoomed through college. I finished my BA in 3 years, just by like taking like 20-something credits a semester and really loading things on. But I emailed my professors. I was like, I need you guys to up the limit on credits I can take. And they were like, this is a bad idea. You shouldn't do this. I was like, I have no friends. I have no life. This is all I'm doing. I just want to finish college. And so they were like, okay, you psycho, whatever,
He's going to end up doing a PhD, I can tell.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, I'm sure that's what they were thinking. So I zoomed through undergrad, so I graduated in 2008, right, which is right into the financial crisis. So there's no jobs anywhere. I couldn't even find like a really bad job in Japan. So I'm working this really kind of uninspiring job in Houston for a few months, but living with my parents, so I'm just pocketing all the money. And I kind of saved up enough, and I kind of heard about this master in the Wudong Mountain in central China, that I was just kind of curious about it. I mean, I'd actually created this kind of life plan for myself where I'd go spend like 10 years in Japan, become a ninja master. Then I'd go spend 3 years on Wudong Mountain and become a Wudang master. And then I'd go to southern India for a year and study Kalaripayattu in Kerala.
Wow, so that's a serious plan.
I was like, I know I'm not going to do this, but I wrote it in my journal anyway. Like, I'll just throw this out there as a life plan, a 20-year plan or something. So since Japan was kind of off, I couldn't find a job there, and I couldn't support myself without a job. China was the next obvious place to go. And so I picked up and went there for 10 months to do a kind of kung fu interim year between undergrad and grad school. And that's where I met my master, Master Yuan Shegong, in the Wudang Sanfeng sect. But he turned out to be starting a kind of 5-year program in 2009. And so I signed up for that, and I kind of left early, went back home, and worked for 6 months to save up enough money to support myself for the next 3 years. So that's how I ended up staying in Wudang from 2008 roughly until 2014.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is amazing. So did you know Chinese already, like when you went to China, or were you just like, here we go, I'm going to learn it while I'm there?
Yeah, I didn't know a single word of Chinese.
Wow.
I always found it to be such an inscrutable language, when I'd like watch Chinese movies. I'm like, I can't even make out where the words separate from one another. Like, whereas Japanese, it's so clear, like kokode, and like it's very, lots of consonants, so you can kind of make sense of things. So I knew Japanese. I could kind of get by in Japanese, and I could read it very well. But I didn't know any Chinese. But I already knew like more than 1,000 Chinese characters because I was, proficient in Japanese. So that actually was super helpful in the beginning. But yeah, I did. I just picked it up in China.
Just out of curiosity, how long did it take you to like become proficient, like, conversationally proficient in Chinese?
About 1.5 years, probably.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. But I was studying a lot. So you can live in China for, I saw this happen. You can live in China for years and years and years and not know any Chinese. It's possible. So
what would be the point? You'd be missing everything.
Yeah. But everyone's there for their own reasons, I guess.
Very true. Very true.
But I studied hard, and I was kind of conversational about 1.5 years in, and after about 3 years, I was probably reading. I was reading books at that point, and that's when I really started studying the classical Chinese. And so I spent the last 2 years there significantly studying classical Chinese, and specifically reading the kind of classical alchemical texts that seemed as if they were like the locus classicus of this subtle body stuff. Yeah.
Wow. So I just have to pause. Like, I want to dig into what those texts were like, but I have to pause because I feel like this is probably like a lot of people's fantasy that you lived out. So what was it actually like to be, living on Wudong Mountain, like training in actual kung fu, like with a master and becoming part of a Taoist lineage?
Yeah, it was, it was like the fulfillment of my childhood fantasies and stuff like that. But of course there were, grittier sides of it that kind of betrayed the romantic vision. It was just, the whole situation of Taoism in China, foreigners in China, is very, very complicated. And basically, China, the 20th century was a real, doozy. I guess is the best word to use there. And so people were coming out of a period of like immense cultural transformation and trauma. And so just my own master, like when I went to Wudang, I kind of had this expectation that my reason for being there was very kind of bourgeois and kind of stupid. And I had this kind of internalized, like, white guilt. I had read, like, Edward Said, and I was like, I'm just this imperialist, jackass and stuff. But when I went there, I found that was completely false. And that, like, my reasons for going to the mountain that had been inspired by these kind of movies about, like, magic, cultivation of these kind of super normal powers and energetic bodies and stuff like that. Those are the exact same reason like everyone was there. Like all of the Chinese students, my own master. My master was raised in Wuhan, where the coronavirus came from. Everybody knows where Wuhan is now. He's from a kind of fishing village outside of Wuhan, and he worked on fishing boats as a kid. So he developed rheumatism in his legs. And he had been dealing with that since he was a child. And he basically kind of got into martial arts as a young kid, 7 years old. Martial arts are absolutely everywhere in China. I think this is something people don't fully understand, but like they're everywhere. Every village has basically its own styles, its own masters. You can't avoid it. It's been a big problem for actually dynasties who have conquered China in the past, because literally everyone does martial arts and they're like trying to stamp it out, but it's whack-a-mole. So yeah, he went to the Shaolin Temple when he was a teenager, but his rheumatism was like just kind of flared up while he was there for a few years. So he went to Wudang because he had heard about this kind of inner energetic practices that could like heal him of it and stuff like that. And he started practicing the inner alchemy, and sure enough cured himself of his rheumatism, which medically doesn't make any sense. But when you're dealing with stuff, there's different rules that reality plays by. So that's all to say that basically I found that I was much more at home there than I kind of expected I would be. And once I learned Chinese and stuff and I could really communicate with the other students, I found that we were all very much kind of in this together. We're all part of this same kind of like global media sphere now that has a huge Chinese element to it. So in America right now, there's all this like kind of China rising anxiety and stuff like that. When I was a kid, it was Japan rising. And so that was actually probably what got me into the whole Japan thing, because Japan is very much in people's consciousness. Now China is the thing in everyone's kind of consciousness. But the kind of cultural fusion has already taken place, is kind of what I discovered. So yeah, there's so many. I could go on and on and on about what it was really like, but it's just all to say that, yeah, it was simultaneously a complete kind of completely different from what I expected, but also different not in all bad ways. It was different in ways that actually made me feel more at home there.
Wow, that's really cool. Just makes me think about karma and potential previous lives and stuff like that. It just sounds very natural.
Yeah.
Not to put my labels onto your experience. Yeah, so I guess coming back to sort of the quest for the subtle body, you're in China, you're reading the text that like the Japanese stuff comes from. What happens now?
Well, this was when I discovered one of the kind of counterintuitive aspects of like historical investigation. And it's that when you really investigate any topic, the deeper you get into it, the more it just dissolves before your eyes. With this everything. And so this is what happened with the subtle body stuff in these kind of Chinese texts. Because now I started getting to know the history of Taoism, its different kind of periodizations of its different teachings, the different ways they thought of the body. Even right now I'm kind of writing this article on the concept of qi, because, everyone knows this word now in English, but the way we use it is actually much more indebted to kind of European traditions coming out of mesmerism and animal magnetism, and has almost nothing to do with its Chinese kind of context, but contexts, because qi has meant many different things throughout different Chinese history. So yeah, I'm doing this whole nerdy thing on this. But this is what I found with the subtle body, is it's like there's the Taoist kind of traditions with these kind of mystical emphases, but there's also the medical tradition with a very different emphasis. And so similar to stuff we were talking about with respect to the kind of Tibetan, that scholars have sort of divided it along medical and tantric lines. There were similar divisions in Chinese history, but even within the medical, there are different paradigms, and within the Taoist, there's all these different ways. And then Tantric Buddhism kind of comes in, it flashes briefly in the Han Dynasty before disappearing, and then comes back with force when the Mongolians take over in the Yuan Dynasty, and the Ming and the Qing. Yeah, so I was like, whoa, this is so complicated. Like, where's my original Batman text map where it just like lays it out for you clearly, and so as I was kind of like frustrated, like how complicated this was, and I just couldn't wrap my head around it. I need several lifetimes to even like analyze all the relevant literature. My classmates and I, every spring, our master would give us sort of like a spring break, and we travel somewhere in China. And we traveled one year to Shahe, which is where in Gansu province, which is Amdo, eastern Tibet, historically, the home to the Labrang Monastery, which is one of like the 6 great monasteries of the Gelug sect of Tibetan Buddhism. And the Gelugpas, I didn't know anything about any of this at the time, but the Gelugpas are like the real scholars, like the most bibliophilic kind of form of Buddhism. And I stumbled into one of their temples, and one of the monks volunteered to take us on a tour of their library. So when it was just like floor to ceiling, like 20-foot ceilings, stacked with these kind of blocks on which were carved all of the sutras for their sutra and tantra colleges that are housed there at the monastery. And it just like blew my mind. And there was even art on the walls depicting kind of esoteric anatomies. And I was like, this is awesome. Like, I never saw any libraries like this in all of the Taoist temples I've been to all over China. That they would have like gods of scholarship that you'd go and pray to when you were like trying to pass the imperial service examinations and stuff like that. But there wasn't that same like culture of like books, printing, that kind of erudition. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, hey, maybe the Tibetan stuff is where I could find the real like rigorous and sophisticated elucidations of this, you know?
Sorry, I'm just laughing because that's the tradition I come from.
Yeah. Does that ring true for you?
Well, I mean, my engagement with Tibetan Buddhism just comes from such a different angle. But yeah, definitely like my scholarly engagement with Tibetan Buddhism is exactly what you're talking about in terms of like you dig into a historical topic and it just starts falling apart in front of your eyes.
Yeah.
I mean, especially with Tibetan history is sort of a sidetrack, but like because they started writing stuff down at exactly the same time, basically that they came into contact with other civilizations, there was a lot of change. And it's just like, you just can never, if you're looking for historical stuff in that tradition, it's unlikely that you're going to find what we would consider historical stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's why I was laughing. But yeah, I'm glad that you stumbled across that monastery because that's actually what led to eventually our paths crossing.
Yeah.
How did that Chinese chapter come to an end? And I mean, obviously I've kind of given it away, but like what came next in terms of your engagement with the subtle body discourse?
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, I spent this time in China and I read all of the kind of alchemical texts and learned the practices. And my teacher, he was not at all into this stuff. He always told me I read way too much. He was like, you read so much, it's actually bad for your liver because there's this connection between the eyes and the liver in Chinese medicine. But then at the same time, he would tell other students, he'd be like, why don't you study as hard as Simon does? He's always reading. So he just, he's just messing with everybody. So my teacher was basically what we would qualify as like an apophatic mystic. He was like, he didn't like books, didn't like reading, didn't like, kind of lots of instruction. You just sit and you just do this thing. And you just do it for years. And, and I found that, that's a legitimate methodology. If you just do a very basic thing for a really, really long time and do it over and over and over again, really wonderful things begin to happen, It's very not American, this kind of attitude, though, I think.
So true.
So, I engaged in the practices of this lineage and had wonderful kind of, experiences and all the kind of stuff that I could ever want or desire. But the intellectual part of me was still a little bit, eager to kind of lock this thing down. And so I kind of stumbled into this Tibetan monastery that turned me on to this Tibetan stuff. And I ended up we finished the program in 2014. And I had done the whole thing, I promised my parents that I'd get a PhD and that when I was going to China, it was just a leap year, guys, no worries. I'll get my PhD afterwards. And then, that turned into leap 6 years. And so they were like, hey, how about that PhD, Simon? And so, because my dad had a PhD and my grandfather had one. So there was kind of like an expectation a little bit. So I got into Rice University in Houston, and that's where you and I met, Claire. And you were my first Tibetan teacher as I was starting to investigate this stuff.
I forgot that. Somehow in my mind, Anne was your first connection, but wow, that's really cool.
No, yeah, you were I took 2 semesters of Tibetan from you. We read Atisha together.
That part I definitely remember.
No, Taranata, yeah.
Yeah, Taranata. I remember going through the alphabet. And it was you and I think one other grad student and just like a sea of undergrads, and probably way less hardcore than what you could have handled, but it was really fun to get your perspective in that room.
Yeah. I appreciated the slow drip introduction. It was nice. It was really nice.
Oh, good. I figured the undergrads would just flee if I went all hardcore.
Oh, yeah. No. Yeah, you don't want to. You have to entice them,
Exactly. I want them to take away the culture part, even if they forget the entire alphabet.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then what was your engagement with like the Tibetan sources like, I mean, you're learning Tibetan, you're starting to dip your toe into that water. Like, what were your expectations and then what happened?
Yeah, so actually studying Tibetan with you and then studying with Anne, it was like just yin and yang, polar opposites, because it's very kind of slow introduction to the alphabet and then very basic reading and stuff. And so I did a year with you, and Anne was like, yeah, you're probably ready for the advanced Tibetan. So then I go into advanced Tibetan, and it's like, boom, drop you right in the deep end. We're reading Longchenpa. We're reading like this, like basically Tibetan mystical poetry, and just like, do your best.
Yeah, that's how I started. That's why I started with the slow drip.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, yeah. I really appreciate that. You were the midwife of this language for me that really eased me into the world,
It's an honor, total honor.
So starting with Anne was like very disorienting at first, but I was, I think, sufficiently detached from the fruits of my actions because of Anne's kind of really encouragement. She wasn't like kind of harsh about anything. She was extremely just like, it was a very exploratory spirit in her classes of Tibetan, and it was just absolutely wonderful. Some of my best classroom experiences were within her advanced Tibetan seminars, where we're all just sitting around, and everyone's vastly different levels of the Tibetan, but we're just kind of exploring the text together through all its kind of semantic and philosophical richness.
Yeah, there is a form of alchemy that happens in those advanced seminars with Anne, I think.
Yeah. It's
magic comes out in the classroom. It's so cool.
Totally, yeah. It's in the space warps around us, and yeah.
Yeah.
It's really cool.
So what text were you digging into during your grad school time?
So the Dalai Lama had visited Rice. You were probably there when he visited, right, Claire?
Yeah, was it back in like 2006 and 7, I want to say?
I think so, yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And Anne sort of hosted him. She was part of that. And while he was there, I guess she asked him what she should focus on. And he said, read Longchenpa's precious treasury of philosophical classics.
Tenets, yeah.
Yeah, philosophical, yeah, thank you.
Drumtatse.
Yeah, the Drumtatse, yeah. So that was what we focused on and took that very seriously. If you've ever seen her copy of Richard Barron's translation of that text, it has like more notes and earmarks than any book I've ever seen in my life. Yeah.
It's probably broken into like 20 different little mini sections too, I would imagine. For just being open so much.
Yeah. So we were reading Longchenpa like, straight from the man himself, and we were reading Jamgon Kongtrul's kind of book on Tantra. And we were doing all this stuff, in Tibetan. And so that's what really kind of brought me into this world. And then really just magically, we had Lama Tenzin Sampal come visit one year, and kind of Anne, I kind of explained to Lama Tenzin my whole situation, how I had studied in China and Taoism. And I actually talked a lot about how the Taoism I was studying was very much shared the fate with Tibetan Buddhism, and that Taoism was just like basically shattered in the 20th century after both before the communists took over and after they took over. And it wasn't until the 1980s that people kind of started, that religious practice was essentially re-legalized in China, and people started kind of putting the pieces back together. And I was studying these texts. And so basically explaining my story to him, that even though I wasn't highly accomplished in his lineage, and also through Anne's kind of recommendation, he saw fit to recommend a very kind of secret text to me from Longchenpa's Ningtik Yapshi, the Khandra Yangtik called the Saptangatyo Trin, the kind of cloud oceans of the profound meaning, that has an extremely detailed subtle body cartography that's specifically geared toward the kind of Tibetan sky gazing practices, you could say.
Oh, wow.
So it's the specific kind of energetic physiology through which you engage in these gazing practices. And so I translated a significant portion of that, actually included in my dissertation as an appendix. So that was the major kind of project I engaged on in the translation of this Tibetan stuff. But at the same time, I explored all around and read, the kind of extensive literature in translation on the 6 yugas of Naropa. And Tsongkhapa has written just absolutely wonderful commentaries on, everything under the sun.
Right.
But it was particularly his commentary he wrote in the last year of his life in 1419. His kind of final major work was a commentary on the Guhya Samaja Tantra, which contains just really extremely clear elucidations of how the kind of subtle anatomy works in the context of Tibetan Buddhist practice. But this is all to say that I kind of engaged with all these different thinkers from all these different lineages and all these different times. And once again, it was the same problem. In the Taoist stuff, I discovered that there were 1,000 different visions and different practices and different justifications and even different metaphysical frameworks and all of this stuff.
I mean, that does sound like, anyway, for me, like the prototypical grad school experience. Like you come in with what you think is a simple question, the whole thing falls apart, and then as you're writing through your dissertation, you start figuring out like, okay, maybe there is something there, but I have to put it together myself.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I have read portions of your dissertation. I haven't read the whole thing, but it's definitely like the dissertation I found most entertaining. And yeah, it's an amazing work that you've done to kind of put together the history of the subtle body in the West, or like the reception history of it. And you're working on a book now, so that's super exciting. We'll have to chat again once that's coming out. So where are you now? Like, where are you with your journey in bringing the subtle body material out to people?
The conclusion I get to in my dissertation, I think I can put this into words without just sounding totally wacky. Is I eventually abandoned the quest for Batman's singular secret scroll. I was like, clearly my whole premise is kind of wrong in this endeavor. And so then I was like, well, what are all these different things then? I mean, these are like, as like white people from America, we have an extremely Eurocentric vision of the history of civilization, So we're like, oh, the great minds from Plato, to James Joyce or whatever. And it's this whole kind of laundry list of white guys. But at the same time, there was this whole other like part of the planet called like Asia, and people were doing really incredible things too. And there were really, really incredible geniuses. And it just happens that in both Tibetan and Chinese and Indian contexts, some of the like finest minds in human history were profoundly taken up with this issue of these kind of occult anatomies and their cultivation and their kind of ramifications of this sort of phenomenology. And so, yeah, my question is like, what is all this about? What are these guys doing? What are they talking about? And I kind of ended up coming to the vision that these subtle bodies, they aren't just like, it's not just like a description of a body that's already there, that's like ready-made inside of you. And you can find this echoed in different thinkers in both Tibetan and Chinese, and I'm not sure about the Indic. I'm not as familiar with the Sanskrit stuff, but I would wager it's the case that you're actually kind of creating these esoteric anatomies within your body through these different practices. And then the question arises, of course, why? And it would seem that these are what facilitates kind of interactions with other aspects of reality. And so I end the dissertation with this kind of observation that these subtle bodies appear not to be just descriptions of a kind of sort of like proto-scientific descriptions of what's actually happening in us, but actually kind of gateways into whole other worlds. So that's kind of where I'm at these days. Yeah.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I guess my last question for you is just, you're a lineage holder in this tradition that was almost, well, like you said, it was shattered in the 20th century.
Yeah.
How do you see your role, or what's your aspiration for, I don't know, the little part that you're contributing to the history of this tradition? What would you like to see that be?
Well, so in my lineage, to become a disciple, you actually don't really need to do anything. You can show up and pay $150 or something and get a little book, and you're a disciple. And so this isn't the way that they wanted it to be. This is kind of the government kind of twisted their arm into opening it up like this. But I don't want to get into the politics of it. But so because it is this way, and my master has these ceremonies, and pretty much anyone can go become a disciple, the lineage doesn't mean really anything in itself. He says that all that being a member of this lineage means is that you help people. And so he leaves it extremely open-ended like that. And I've come to have a very kind of just local view of efficacy. So all I want to do is a kind of well, in grad school, Claire, you were one of the people that pushed me to start doing this. I taught Kung Fu in the park and Qigong and Tai Chi and stuff like this. And it was just sort of something I did for fun. But then people started coming, and I made all these people that I never would have met otherwise. And we created this really wonderful little community where we were just sort of exploring this stuff together, Mm-hmm. I have a lot of this knowledge, but I didn't really feel like I was the master or anything. Mm-hmm. People would show up, and we'd train together, and, it was really wonderful. And it really helped people in their lives. This, one woman was kind of going through a divorce and said that our Tai Chi class was what got her through it.
Aww.
And we were oh, we're just having fun here. It's so wonderful that it could have that effect on you.
Yeah.
And so that made me have this very local view of kind of what helping actually means. Mm. And so we just have these little groups, and we get together here now where we are in Canada, and we're kind of building up another community, and that's all. Very modest goals. I don't want to bring in some usher in some era of Sino-futurism or somehow, or fusing Taoism with bionic bodies, or. But I know people who think that like that. So wow. I try to keep everything very small scale.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Your vision seems a lot more doable.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Simon, for sharing your wisdom with us and sharing your story, and just for being willing to share the personal side of it too, because I know it is actually kind of uncomfortable sometimes to open up about that stuff.
Yeah, well, somehow you make it comfortable. You're, an old friend or something. Maybe I have the illusion that this is just between us or something. But yeah, it's very my pleasure to share today. Thank you for giving me this opportunity, Claire.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I hope a lot of this, I don't know, I hope there's benefit that kind of echoes out for people. And at the moment, given my number of YouTube subscribers, it is basically just us. So if that's any comfort.
That's good to know, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Simon. It's been a real pleasure to I don't know, get to vicariously experience your journey for, longer than I thought this would take. But yeah, and also just to kind of to have known you for a while now, and to see your engagement with Tibetan Buddhism. And honestly, because I practice the tradition, I haven't read probably almost all of the stuff that you've read on the tantras and the subtle body. So I feel like I've learned a lot. And yeah, I just want to say thank you, and I look forward to hopefully getting to be your student again at some point.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Claire. I look forward to being your student too at some point.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for coming along for today's exploration of the process of letting grow. If you found this episode helpful, please share it. And subscribe now wherever you listen to podcasts so you're always in the loop. For links to more content related to today's episode, please see the show notes. See you again next week.